All right, so I want to thank everyone for coming, and thank you to the Maine Humanities Council for sponsoring this event and allowing us to bring Meghan Gilliss here to talk about her book Lungfish, which a lot of us have read for this month. So without any further ado, I'll hand it off to Meghan.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here, and yes, thank you to the Maine Humanities Council for making it possible. First things first, can you hear me?
Okay.
Yeah? Okay. I tend to go quiet, so if at any point I start trailing off, just flag me down. And if I don't notice you, get verbal with me and just shout, we can't hear. So I just heard you all have been reading this book for your book club, which is lovely to know. I've been doing these little conversational events throughout the summer, and I never know whether I'm engaging with people who have read the book or not, but it's definitely always a little bit more fun to talk with folks who have at least started it or know a little bit about it. So I was excited to know that maybe some of you have read it. I'll just tell you a little bit about me so you have a tiny bit of context for who I am. My name is Meghan. I've lived in Portland for about 13 years now, but I am not a native Mainer. I grew up down in Kentucky, and then I tried to live in California a few times and just kept getting like spat back out. Spent a chunk of years in Missouri, of all places. Went to school there and then opened a little bookstore there. And then moved up here in 2010. I feel like a real Mainer. I put in a solid decade working the circulation desk at the public library there in Portland, which I feel like that like earns somebody a place in any community. And then I've also raised a child in Maine. My daughter is 8 now. So while I'm not a native Mainer, I feel as rooted here as any other place at this point. So Lungfish is my first novel. I wrote short stories before I wrote this book. And I never imagined myself writing a novel until things got really difficult financially. Like I was very broke, had a baby, didn't understand why I was so broke, much like the narrator in this book, sort of had to struggle to put together the pieces to understand that my husband had a drug addiction that was draining us. So in the midst of this brokenness, I began to joke with my best friend, like, how does one actually earn money in Maine? I don't know if any of you have encountered this problem, but yeah, it's difficult, especially if you have a degree in journalism and have decided you don't want to do journalism anymore. So I began to joke about writing a bestseller. I had gone to a creative writing program, was massively indebted, remain massively indebted to this writing program. So I began to think about writing a bestseller as just like this complete joke that I would bring up with my best friend from time to time as the only possible way that I could ever make money. Which I think was really useful because I think if I seriously thought that I was going to try to write a novel, I would have been far too intimidated to do it. But because it was sort of thinking about it in this way where I wasn't taking it that seriously, on some level I tricked myself into taking on a project that was much bigger than anything that I actually had the space in my life for. So I spent the next 6 years, give or take a few months, writing this novel in really small bits. As I mentioned, I have a daughter who's 8 now, so when I started this novel, she was she was 1. She grew over the course of me writing this book, but in the beginning she was 1, and I was working and raising a child, and so I began to write in this way that I think more and more parent writers especially mother writers are starting to write, which is in much shorter spurts. And if you've read the book, you probably know that it's written in sort of in vignette form. There are some parts of the book that have some continuous pages, paragraphs that build off of one another. And that probably means that for whatever reason, on the day I was writing that section of the book, my daughter decided to actually sleep in and not wake up the second I tried to sneak out of bed. So I think that there were some huge logistical challenges to getting the book written because of that scenario, but I also think there's something about only having a few minutes a day to write something that you've sort of been distilling in your head all day and maybe even all night. I actually think there's a lot that our brains do while we're sleeping and dreaming, and I've always preferred those very early hour mornings for writing. So I like to think that what made it to the page is there because it was compelling enough to me to remain, it was a sentence that remained there throughout the day and that I sort of chewed on and worked on throughout the day. So that's how it was written, without any kind of plan or outline, which means that it became very messy to revise. I had a lot of regrets when I got to the revision phase of writing this novel. I had great fun writing it line by line, and I will just say quickly that as I was writing it, I was sort of using it as like a journal in fictional form. I think, having a loved one, being financially dependent, finding oneself, at least momentarily, financially dependent on somebody with a drug addiction, it puts you in a lot of really strange headspaces. There's denial that comes into play. There's sort of lack of trust in oneself to understand what's going on. And one just begins thinking the strangest things and feeling the strangest things. And I didn't find those things very pleasant, but I did find them to be very interesting. I mean, they were not uninteresting. And I also struggle a lot with my memory, as probably some of you. I have had Lyme disease and, I've had all the brain fog for years and stuff, and I feel like a lot of stuff just slips through me. So for better or for worse, I began using this novel as a place to try to preserve some of the strangeness of that time, because I wanted to be able to share it with the world in a way that was sort of relatable and immediate and brought readers through it. So that's a little bit about how this book was written. I think what I'll do now, unless there are any objections, is maybe just read a chapter and then hopefully we can just talk. So I guess I issue that as a warning that I would love it if you try to think of some questions, whether or not they're related to the section that I read or not. I tend to read from the beginning of this book because I find it really difficult to bring an audience that's not familiar with the book up to speed. Like, I can find almost no sections later on in the book that don't somehow incorporate something that feels critical from earlier. So I tend to take it easy on myself and read from early on, but I decided tonight, again, for better or for worse, I'm just going to drop you all right down, kind of smack in the middle of the book. I'm going to read a chapter called Spoon, which reflects a little bit of a change in tone and situation for this family. And if you haven't read it and you have no idea what's going on, I apologize, and hopefully you'll just enjoy listening enough that you'll want to read the rest of it.
What page are you going to start at?
143?
Okay, I want to just read along with you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Would anybody else like a read-along copy? No? Okay. So this is the part where you're probably really going to have to flag me if my volume starts to drop. I won't be offended. Spoon. It's no longer the island of my grandmother's house. It's the island of eelgrass and jackknife clams, waved whelks and dead man's fingers, of bull thistle, nightshade, and hawkweed, of sheets of pearly everlasting. It's the island of sugar kelp, soft sour reed, and of course the waving beds of purple dulse. When we're ahead of the gulls, it's the island of Aristotle's lanterns pried from the mouths of washed-up urchins with the stink still on them. These are the urchins that died free enough to be carried by the tides, the ones that did not use their teeth to scrape out little burrows for themselves in rock and coral, the ones that did not grow too large inside these burrows to move again, the ones that were not tucked in for their deaths. I wonder if my grandmother read the books on her shelf the way that I do now, if to her this island was never hers, but the home of 1,000 clamoring species, the names of which rattled through her brain. I wonder if this was the drama that sustained her, the contents of the inner life that showed itself only as the quiet smile, the mask of a hum. La-di-di-da-di-di-da-di-di-do. It was dusk, and she led me by the hand deep into the ferns to show me where the spring bubbled up into a little marsh, the frog eggs attached to the underbellies of wide blades of pale grass. These frogs can only live right here, she said. I remember the rustling through the undergrowth, the long, low bronk moving with the ferns, my grandmother giving my hand a gentle squeeze and saying only, "Buttermilk." I wasn't sure where this new endearment came from, whether she had me mixed up with someone else, if there was something I was supposed to understand. I held her hand and kept silent to mask my confusion. As a child here, I could lie awake in the silence, or I could slide out from beneath the heavy blankets and creep down the dark steps and into the blackness of the trees. I could lose myself in the darkness and still know I wasn't lost. The ocean hemmed us in. It was just a matter of time before I found my way back to the house, stepping carefully so as not to get hurt, placing my hands against the trunks of trees, one and then another, feeling my way through, then climbed the dark stairs back to my bed with my hands on the top of each step, and finally fell asleep. I could do that once each summer in the beginning, while everyone else slept or tried to sleep in the different kind of quiet and stillness. And for the week that followed, I could fall asleep as soon as my head hit the pillow, just after I'd blown out my candle. There's a figure moving behind the window of the shed. Do I put my hand over Agnes's mouth or invent a story, a game, as I pull her out of sleep, as we run into the trees? But it's only Paul, with an axe, moving toward the heap of unsplit wood. When we came back, Agnes still wrapped with the yellow characters, thrilled by our adventure. He'd been asleep on the hard wood of the dock. He sat up, then stood as we approached and said nothing, and helped with the ropes, and then I let him hold me. The silence existed alongside Agnes, who was a flood of accounts. There was a guy buying a piece of a cow, and I felt the clench in his stomach too, and Agnes was still going. And Mama peed on her shoe. Please, such a tiny bit. A lot. The most terrifying thing that ever happened on one of those nights in the woods was my hand landed on something that wasn't a tree. It was smooth and soft, but hard too. It was a face, and I was shot out of my body, and then I heard my brother's voice, and it was him. He'd followed me. The cards are still scattered across the floor, the storm having blown through the house, its windows left open, along with everything else. and I sweep them into a pile, shape them into a neat, dirty stack. I line the rocks and bone and skin and mussel shells along the windowsill. I'll teach her, next, how to play war. The airtime was reserved for something more drastic. No one's quite willing to say, yeah, we got off easy. There's a segment about an eagle's nest that was blown out of its tree. A camera crew has been filming the family as they try to regroup. Conservationists are on hand if they're needed. It's a pledge drive day. Maybe next time, I say, and turn it off. But thank you. I never gave much thought to why my brother came looking for me in the dark. I never imagined what it was like to have been found in that way. I wade through the waist-deep ferns and come out onto the little promontory that looks eastward toward the Sound. To the south, the ocean is moving, a great roiling darkness like a shadow headed this way. Where my heart was, a fish. The roiling begins to break apart into fragments of black and fragments of white, into a dozen, then dozens of distinct shapes. Eiders, on the wing. Low, low, low. Then out beyond the Sound, gone. At dusk, I take Agnes walking through the ferns, hoping to hear it, the gronk, for a chance to say, buttermonk, and squeeze her hand to see what she'll understand, what she'll take and what she won't. But it was weird, as the folks on the radio were getting at, for a storm like that to come now. It wasn't that bad here, but it was bad, down there. I'd nearly forgotten that part. I'm having a hard time keeping track of everything, what should cause dread and what shouldn't. Maintaining the right perspective, always. Aside from everything, I know almost nothing about the arc of this place, the phenology, have only dropped down occasionally. I've never seen things all the way through. One thing at a time. I stick the letters on carefully. The beach, too, is littered. Irish moss, shimmering purple clusters of tough, flat fronds. The ocean is calm. I once saw my grandmother gather the stuff in her skirt. She wrapped it in cheesecloth and boiled it with milk and sugar. She gave us each a spoonful warm, then canned the rest. I don't have milk or sugar or cheesecloth, but I have a stove for now, and I have running water, and I have a reasonably clean sock I stretch until its porousness feels right to me. As it boils inside the sock, the weed releases its clear goo. I let it cool. The jelly tastes like nothing, but feels good to eat straight off the spoon. Agnes knows what's funny better than I did at her age. Take some to Papa. Better her than me, I think. We climb into the dinghy and I push us away from the dock, maneuver the oars into their locks. As we approach the ledge beyond the shelter of the island, but visible, the seals slide off the rock to watch us from the water before disappearing altogether. The family of ospreys doesn't budge from its nest at the top of the ledge marking pole. They look shell-shocked, I think, 3 downy babies and a mother huddled. Agnes and I clamber out of the boat onto the uneven rock covered in slick weed. We hang onto it in places, thick fistfuls, to keep our footing. I'm almost done.
Okay.
I lift Agnes to the high point, then climb to meet her. I take from my pockets the yellow strip torn from one of my grandmother's bed sheets and tie the end of it as tightly as I can to the pole. Today it hangs, barely stirred by gentle breaths of wind. We'll be able to see it from the dock. We'll be able to see what's really going on. Okay, so yeah, that's the part that I read to you.
It's
Yeah.
half working, so I'm gonna go get more batteries.
Okay.
I don't know what's going on, but
I have that effect on technology.
I have a question for
Yeah.
you. It's quite an interesting journey to work with an editor, and I think your book is one that would have either an easy journey or very difficult with an editor. You want to talk about how that process works for you?
Yeah, to the extent that I can remember any of it. I think you know how you sort of block out trauma. I should start by saying that in a way this book had two editors. I was very lucky. My literary agent, Sarah Bolin, began working with me right after she switched from working as an editor at Riverhead to becoming an agent. So she brought with her this wealth of editorial experience, and she was able to give me enough guidance along the way to help me get it to a place where we would then start shopping it out. So I can't remember exactly what she said or did. I think, you know, a lot of it was just sort of questions, you know, and then polite encouragement, like not it's not ready, but like, oh, I think you're on the right track. I think, you know, I think we're almost to the point where we can start sending it out. So she pushed me really to make it as good as I could. And then, as far as working with the actual editor, you know, it's sort of interesting. So when you're shopping a book around, it sounds like you're familiar with the process a little bit, but when there's an editor who's interested in acquiring your book, usually you schedule like an editorial call where you just sort of make sure that your visions for the book are aligned before you sign on with them. So, for instance, there was an editor from a larger press who was interested but made it very clear she wanted to see a lot of changes that were sort of market driven, and she felt like there was far too much isolation in the book and that wasn't going to give enough people a character that they could relate strongly with. So there was a push to have more characters simply so that there was more variety of characters, right? Which, you know, it's always tempting to go with a bigger house, but then, you know, I think ultimately this is when I knew, oh, I'm not trying to write a bestseller, like I'm trying to write my book. And then when I had a call with Kendall, who is with Catapult, which is the publishing house that helped make this book. It was very, you know, she just asked questions about what I wanted the book to be and in which directions I would want to push it, and then she was there to support that, which was lovely. So as an editor, both Kendall and Sarah were wonderful editors in that they just ask small questions, which I think for a lot of writers is all you want. Yeah, so, you know, that was the process of working with an editor. The process of revising it on my own, sort of between submitting drafts to my editor, was really horrendous and messy and involved cutting the book up into a million pieces and laying everything out chronologically and then feeling really defeated by it and feeling, you know, when you lay a story out chronologically, it sort of loses all of its art, and it also reveals to you a lot of problems. So there was a lot that helped me realize there was a lot to resolve, but also helped me realize where there actually needed to be more sort of action or dramatic tension to help move a reader along. And having an editor was really great for that too, just being able to be like, hey, why don't you remind us of this pressure here? So I think Kendall's input on that level helped in some ways this book read like a thriller, which is something that has really surprised me. Like I've seen it classified in various libraries and places as a psychological thriller, which I never imagined I was writing. But I think having some of the tension ratcheted up like that, I suppose, made it a little bit of a turn pager for some people, for the people who are willing to read another page. Anyway. Yeah.
To me, it read like a poem. And some of the chapter that you will pick is really good because it emphasized some of the paragraphs was short but filled with so much, and others just kept telling the story. I liked your style of writing, but it really was a journey, and I was wondering how much of that was whatever the word is.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, at this point, the honest answer is that I kind of forget. Everything is kind of mixed up, real life and the book. But I think what I would say is that the emotional conditions feel autobiographical, but the actual scenario is fictional, and I draw on parts of my life. I draw on things that I have familiarity with, right? So for the setting, this island, you know, I very much drew on a particular island where my family has a home, so I felt deeply connected to it. But in my real life, it had nothing to do with our sort of addiction arc and overcoming addiction arc. You know, the Tuck as a character, I feel like is very close to me. All of her faults are my faults as well. But the child in the story is very different from my child, and that was important to me to not use my child in that way. So I did use my child in the sense that she sort of helped me understand what a 2-year-old might be saying and thinking at that point in development, but was saying things that were wildly different and having actions that were wildly different from the ones my own child was having.
So you didn't leave your child in bed to cry? You know, go poke her, right?
I have never been able to leave my child in bed to cry, which is why she's 8 and she still can't sleep alone. Yeah. No, actually, we did try the cry it out method for a while because that's what all the doctors say you're supposed to do. And I swear to God, I think it probably works for some children, but there are some children who will never stop screaming and who are deeply tortured by the absence of their parents. So yeah, those are some of the roughest weeks when I did try in like a medically advisable way to leave my child alone to cry in bed. Yeah. But I mean, she did, like the narrator of this book, I made choices that were misguided and that were based on denial and probably not dealing with the situation as immediately as I should have, that, probably will have lasting impact. I think we experienced hunger early on that probably, in some way is sort of just part of who she is now. So I'm not innocent of all of Tuck's sort of, I would like to call them mistakes, honest mistakes, hopefully relatable ones, but yeah, now I'm rambling.
I just think it's interesting that one of the editors that you did go with wanted to bring in more characters, in that, I have to say, I didn't finish it, but that's actually the solidarity gives it more emphasis, I think. That situation, how many really do go it alone.
Yeah.
And so I think actually it plays better the way it is now versus bringing others in.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, whether or not your story is unfolding on a remote island, the fact is that addiction has a way of isolating.
Oh, definitely.
Not just the people who have the addiction, but those around them, because there's such stigma, and I think that isolation is at the root of a lot of the continuation of the problem. So.
And with other social issues too. I mean, you do abusive, same kind of category, it's very much an isolation.
Yeah, I think that's true. I've been invited to speak with a group down in Portland that serves survivors of domestic abuse.
Yeah.
And at first I was like, well, why are they reading, it's like the staff are reading the book for their book club. I was like, well, why do they want me to come? And then realizing, oh, it's all the same root issues of
Right.
isolation.
The
And, yeah,
denial
Yeah.
and how you deal and missteps,
yeah.
you know, they go a lot of our nature problems, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, so what I've heard from people, that while this story deals very much with addiction specifically, that people can relate to it on a lot of different levels. Yeah.
It seems to me that the chapter you just read is where she's kind of piecing together how she feels so devalued in her situation and trying to piece together like where she is in relation to the world around her, trying to make sense of it.
Yeah, I think I stopped a little short in part because the microphone wasn't working, and in part because I felt like I'd been going on too long. But at the end of that chapter, we see, Paul has sort of gotten himself through this detox period and is, maybe coming back into himself. And we see, Tuck is watching Agnes being drawn to him and watching the ease with which they relate to one another, and is feeling sort of monstrous, I think, and I think feeling, like you said, so undervalued and sort of having all of these emotions that one doesn't want to have as one's child and husband, build a relationship with one another, but feeling, I think, unsure of what she is outside of this immediate emergency mode of my job is to take care of this child and to hide the problem to the extent that I can. And I think you're right, there's sort of a driftlessness there where it's like, okay, what? Hi. Who am I now? Yeah. And I think Tuck has to deal with a lot of that, of sort of what have I become inadvertently by making, having the reactions that I've had to this situation and feeling unrecognizable to herself at times.
Neighborhood cat wanders in and out sometimes.
Name?
He's Sparky. We were calling him Dewey just because he was hanging out at the library. Then we found out his real name is Sparky. He lives 2 houses down.
That's sweet.
I have another question.
Yeah.
Where did you get all your information about edibles?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, things I've never even heard of before.
So my real grandmother's house on a real island has bookshelves full of books that have been around for centuries. Sam is my dad's cousin, guys. I don't know how many of you know Sam, or please make that clear. So he is familiar with the island that is different from the one presented in this book in some ways, but that I definitely, drew on in creating the setting. But she had all kinds of old field guides from the 70s that I had never noticed before, and until I started writing this book. And I just read a quote this morning in the Paris Review. I think it was Eudora Welty, who said something like, when you're writing a novel, it seems as if everything in the world is there to feed into your novel. Mm-hmm. And you start noticing things in this new way, like, oh, is this useful? Could this be useful? So I began noticing those field guides. And I also was working at the circulation desk at the library, so I was always mining the return bin. And then scrawling out notes and sticking them under the keyboard so that I could turn them into fiction later. Yeah. Yeah.
Megan, after you read that chapter, I wanted us to all just be still for a while because the language is so beautiful. And I was just fully present there on whatever island this is. I just couldn't stop reading your book. I think it's absolutely beautiful, and that Tuck is a hero and an amazing seaweed. But, you know, it's so much more than seaweed. It is so much more that Tuck provided for Agnes, and I just loved it, absolutely loved it, so thank you.
That's really kind of you. Thank you. I'm not going to cry. But it was really important to me that, you know, I think, you know, motherhood, especially those early years, like, I think in a way, personally, Meghan, the writer, I felt, at the time, robbed of an experience. Like, this is not what I imagined these years being like. But then, of course, it becomes really silly to focus on that. And so, okay, so maybe you're not noticing all of the beauty of it with your partner as you imagined you would, because they've been taken over, hijacked, essentially. So it felt, I mean, maybe recording, you know, sort of capturing the beauty of those years with readers felt important to me, just so I wasn't sort of witnessing it all alone. Because I do think that's something that's meant to be shared. I think the wonder of those years. Yeah, but thank you for saying it's beautiful. It was important to me too that this book was, you know, had some buoyancy. I didn't want it to be all doom and gloom. I mean, there is a lot of wonder in those years, no matter, and people raise kids in horrible circumstances, and there's still joy every day, hopefully, and I think, you know, it's important to me to capture that as well.
And the way Agnes responded, you know, to all the wonder around her,
Mm-hmm.
and every day a new day for her, really came through, so,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, it was fun to play with her and to make her so different from Tuck and sort of challenging her and, you know, pushing her own boundaries. You know, it's such a small scene, but for whatever reason, I really like the scene with the starfish when they're on the dock, and you know, Agnes really wants Tuck to pick it up, and Tuck is scared, and yeah, I like the way that Agnes makes Tuck push her own boundaries. Children do that to us all the time.
But I like that Tuck realized that this daughter was very different from herself. That was just neat. I mean, I don't think every parent recognizes that from an early age. This is a separate person, and you have to pay attention
Yeah.
to what they say, what they notice.
Yeah, it's a struggle.
But it was also so honest and true that you didn't like candy coat the frustration of, you know, dealing with somebody who's fundamentally very different. And yeah, respecting that, and oh my gosh, she did so much. That was amazing.
You guys are so much kinder than the woman who reviewed the book in the New York Times. Who he gave us a nice full quote, but I felt like fundamentally misunderstood the point of the book.
Maybe, yeah, I mean, put yourself in that position on an island, basically figuring out how to keep this little girl growing. Maybe that reviewer has never been on an island or been that isolated. To me, it was so real. And yeah, the other thing that captured me that wasn't outright said but came through was how Tuck found it the futility of trying to communicate with her husband. Like there was no screaming, there was no nagging. It's just like I see things aren't happening, and she just like kind of withdrew like a snail and thought, well, I'm gonna have to figure out how to do this because I'm not getting help from him. She was mad about it, but she wasn't like just. She knew she had to deal because of her. It's just.
I also loved how the grandmother was throughout. You know, what the grandmother had shared with Tuck as Tuck was growing was so much a part of it all. Not just the books. The grandmother relationship almost continued.
Strong, and she thought the daughter was like her.
Yeah, you know, there was a lot lot of backstory with the family woven throughout, and I didn't mean to. I feel like Tuck comes to a new understanding of every member of her family over the course of this summer, and I didn't set out for that to happen, and that's what I love about, for me, Sparky's trying to trick people back there. For me, the fun of writing is discovering what happens, and I mentioned that I wrote without an outline, but I've always been, as a reader, really drawn to books that sort of unfold in the moment, you know, in part because it's more poetic, because there's more emphasis on image and moment, and it forces the reader to bring their own meaning to things. So I think it appeals to me in that way, but also because when it lands somewhere, I think it's as much a surprise to the writer as it is to the reader, and it doesn't always work, but when it does, to me, it feels more genuine. Like, you know, when a book is plotted out, like, I often put things aside because I'm like, oh, they're trying to make me feel a certain way or like bring me to a certain place, and this style can be gimmicky, you know, if it's used inappropriately, but I keep coming back to it as a way to sort of just discover things and sort of hope for the best and hope that something fortuitous will happen and that the character will learn things and that I'll learn things, and I really did learn from this book enormously. Like, I didn't think I was writing this book because it was my way of like finding my way through a situation, but looking back on it now, I'm like, oh, this book is how I found my way through this situation, and it's kind of weird that I decided to publish it and brought everyone along with it, with me on that. But that's just sort of the way it goes. And I think before I started writing this book, I relied on some conventional advice, which I rarely do. I'll be honest, I'm like stubborn, as you might have guessed. I already said I'm similar to Tuck in certain ways, but I, for whatever reason, at some point, like in my creative writing education, somebody said, you know, one should always allow for the coolness of time before you begin to write about a subject that's close. You know, you don't want to bring a reader through your messiness, sort of figuring things out with you. You want to be able to present things with some clarity and some perspective. So obviously I didn't do that with this book, and I think that was a risk, but I don't know, I'm happy with the way it turned out. So, for the most part, I'm not saying it's.
I read an article early on, I think it was Maine magazine, where they had written about the book, mentioned that it was a lot about addiction. So when I started the book, that was helpful to me. So I was curious, and so I was linked into that issue early on in the book. But it's been interesting to hear how you came to the book, because I just couldn't imagine how somebody could, if you hadn't been through this, could take us with you through this issue of a partner who is addicted. I thought, this isn't something you can make up or ask interviews with, and you know, how was it? It's very intense, and also the island life. You know, it's just beautiful how you pulled that in, and the fear of, you know, getting to the mainland with the boat and with that small child, and you know, surviving this situation. So it's really fun to hear you connecting, and it was disconnected. That never bothers me, because I think so much of my brain is disconnected. I just keep moving through, and eventually things fall into puddles.
Yeah.
But I thought it was well done, and the reality of the island and the rowboat and nickel and diming, you know, trying to put a few pennies together, and then this overwhelming issue that you're partly ignoring and partly dealing with on your own terms. Just a really fascinating read. You did bring us, you know, with you very well, so we could have some idea what people go through.
Yeah, thank you. I do think it's interesting that this book is being discussed sort of in tandem with Morgan Tulke's book, because both deal with addiction, but from such different angles. I mean, in Night of the Living read, that addiction is just part of life. It's taken for granted. All of the characters know what's going on. They've been born into it. And so it's treated with humor, which feels so different from the way that it's encountered in this book when you have a character to whom it's very foreign. And I love that there's a place for both and the conversations that we're having.
How'd you come up with the bumper sticker piece?
Huh. Okay, I borrowed from real life for that. My real father, who is not really like, would you say that he's like the father in this book? He's not. No, he's a very present, loving father.
Yeah.
He's very lucky to have him. But he has had some bad ideas in his life. And he did spend a lot of money he didn't have when I was probably 12. Turning our living room into a production room for these bumper sticker kits, and then trying desperately to sell them to places. And they were ugly. Like, it could have maybe been successful if he had like any real
Design.
I mean, he's an architect. He should have understand some basic principles. But they were just, the color combinations were bad. And,
He didn't ask you which colors were with that.
No, he's still that way. Yeah.
But at first I'm like, cat. What did she pull it out here? And then
Yeah.
it took a minute to figure out what you were doing. But that's so real. I mean, here in Maine, especially, for people to make things and then try to sell them to real stores, retail stores.
Yeah.
Or set up shop on the side of the road.
Yeah. Yeah, and that was such a fun. I don't know how those books came into play. I mean, how the kits came in. Like, sometimes you just write things and you don't know why. But I did have fun working with them because Tuck has nobody to talk to, no adults to talk to, right? And so the bumper stickers become that sort of very inappropriate outlet for trying to.
And to be, and I'm just thinking this, be in her grandmother's house, you kind of wonder what's left behind. My mother-in-law at 93 has passed away, and they're going through that house and pictures from the past that they're really cool, but we don't know who anybody is, that kind of thing. It's just kind of, imagine going through that island home and like the bookshelves and what other things are stuck away and some crannies of the past.
I have a horrible confession to make, and I feel like you all might chase me out of town. I don't know.
There was no bookcase in the house.
This past, so we're also cleaning out this grandmother's house. As many people in Maine, in order to sort of hang on to this property now with like taxes going up, but okay, like we have to start renting it out, and so part of that is cleaning it out more. And so what that meant this past weekend was pulling all of the books that had been in the family for 70 years, and making decisions about which ones were not too mildewy or racist by today's standards to keep, and which ones to get rid of, which when you're on an island that's only accessible by boat, kind of meant having a big bonfire and burning a lot of books, which we all felt very awkward about. But
it's like cremation. I think it's a humane way to deal with the old mildewy book.
Thank you.
Personally, and I have a problem with books.
She'd be the one that would be after you for burning. Good job. Jamie.
I burn some though, it's humane.
Thank you. Yeah, there were certain moments where like a certain page would flutter up against the grate and it would have somebody's like childhood signature. And there was some religious text involved as well. And then we felt like the flames had a special sort of vengeful quality. But
I like that Agnes wanted rumpelstilts, the old fairy tales versus, because Tot was having a hard time reading, thinking they might be too scary for her, but
Yeah.
You go back and that's what they were, I mean,
Kids, man.
yeah, you go.
So it was the minions.
Yeah, the minions, yeah.
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 I was, I work for Goodwill now, which is random and it doesn't matter much, but I had a tour of their warehouse the other day where all the good stuff goes so that it can be sold online, and I was like, oh, this is where all the good stuff goes. So last night when I couldn't sleep, I was like, all right, I'm gonna go to like the Goodwill online, whatever it is, and I was just scrolling randomly, and almost immediately a Minions blanket jumped out at me. I was like, oh.
Yeah, that's the good stuff.
Yeah, yeah, obviously, it's like $3 or whatever. So, yeah.
Do you think you'll do another one?
I am trying to finish a collection of short stories. I wrote a lot of them before the world spun out of control. So in a way, they feel sort of naive and innocent to me. But what each of them involves, I've noticed, is sort of a loss of psychological footing, sort of similar to what Tuck experiences at points in this novel. I think I'm really interested in those moments when rational, thoughtful people start to think very strange things. So what I'm trying to do now is sort of bridge that and sort of explore along the way how we go from losing that psychological footing individually and what that means, and then what it means when society has lost its psychological footing, and what does it mean to be sane in the midst of that. So I don't know yet whether I'm going to be successful at building that bridge, but that's what I'm trying to do right now.
Are you talking about why this happens to people? Like trying to figure out why some women get involved in this or why it happens?
So
To you, to others.
like the loss of psychological footing.
If that's what you're calling it. Is that what you're calling it?
In regards to the news stories, yeah, I think I'm interested in those moments where we sort of lose ourselves.
So no connection at all to the losing your psychological footing, if you could call it that, and finding yourself in a situation that's abusive,
I think as
I'm sorry, I asked awful hard questions.
no, that's great. Yeah, I don't know that personally as a writer I set out to answer explicit questions or try to solve issues. I think that happens naturally through the process of writing. I think that's what writing does, is it helps us figure things out. But I don't, certainly do I think it has been helpful to me to sort of write this book and then be able to see myself a little bit in some of my choices more objectively, and do I think that would help me maybe not make the same choices again? And do I think, even being really idealistic, that maybe somebody in a similar situation would read this book and be more aware of some of the pitfalls and be able to avoid them?
Something like that. I think so. I think that there is, I just feel that there is a lot of shame involved with it, unless you can sort yourself through it. Now, you can look at it and go, it's certainly not my fault that the person I picked to get married to decided to become a drug addict. That's kind of an easy, happens to a lot of people these days and everything. But I think underneath every person who's in a relationship like that, you can't help but sit there and go, well, was there something wrong with me? Or how come I didn't you know, why did I pick somebody who would do that or something?
Yeah, I mean, I think I
mean,
hope.
you probably don't dwell on it because you overcame it, so.
Yeah, but I hope that the book is an exploration of that and how that happens and how those choices are made in a way that makes them relatable, maybe to somebody who has not been in that
I just
situation.
didn't know if the short stories were kind of building off of that, or you called it a psychological losing with footing.
Mm. Yeah, no, I think they're pretty different. I think that's just something they share in common with this, is that tendency for their characters to go off the rails a little bit. Just in like these minor little, like, just for a little schism, you know?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, but the issue of shame around some of these things is interesting. I am having a much better time talking with folks about this book now, because I have decided to just sort of be honest about the fact that yes, like my husband was experiencing addiction when I began writing this book. He's still, an addict. He would tell you as much. He's 3 years in recovery. And when the book first came out, I didn't want to say that publicly because I felt like that was his business, and also because there is still this stigma. I worried that in Maine, a small town of a state, that it would impact things like his career opportunities. But at a certain point, I had his blessing. He's at that point, I think, where he's able to take accountability for the things that happened. And it feels, I'm no longer like contorting myself as I try to talk about the book and how it came to be. So.
It's all right. I overthink everything, don't worry.
Yeah, who doesn't?
I think too, the whole issue of shame is an interesting one because we have so many people who are homeless. And I think the whole idea of shame needs to be thrown in the bushes because we need understanding. Because we all are on the verge of these psychological, wobbles. And whether it's addiction or whether it's homelessness or whether it's joblessness, and it's so much more important that we find understanding, which I think this book helps us find, whether it's the child screaming at night. I couldn't do that either. I got mononucleosis because they both started waking up at separate times when they were both tiny. So I think we all come to these underpinnings, but the need to understand each other and our situations is so much more important than buttoning up all our emotional baggage and holding it forever. Which our mothers did. I don't know, my mother did.
Absolutely, and I think I started to say earlier and then, got distracted as I rambled on. But when I was in that period of early motherhood, I felt a little angry that I had been like robbed of this, what I expected that those years would be. Of course, now I know better. I know, well, nothing is ever what we expect it to be, and how silly of me to. It was like I was sold some vision of early motherhood, and this is what everyone deserves, and you shall have it too. And I thought I was a compassionate person. I worked at the front desk of the Portland Public Library. I was in contact regularly with people who were a lot less fortunate, and I thought I was very kind and understanding. But it wasn't until I was completely humbled by this experience and really was shown, oh, if you didn't have a safety net, a family who could step in, make sure you had a roof over your head, I would be, at the resource center along with the other family. The resource center was right next to my child's daycare, so I would be in this stressed out state, taking her to the daycare center, seeing people wrapped in blankets, and there were days when I was just like, there but for the grace of God. It was just a hair's difference, and I think it wasn't until I came that close that I actually became a good enough person to understand the difference between what just having a safety net means for a person and not, and how easy it is.
I just wonder, it's not so much that you feel shame, and the shame is, something you should just accept and not be putting on to people. I wonder, what it is that causes some people to wind up in this situation, and that's what I find interesting. Is it because they're nice people? Is that how they somehow get kind of shuffled into that?
I think niceness is probably a comorbidity. Yeah.
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 I'm just,
Well, it's probably the, like, you was envisioned a certain, period of life with your child, and that was kind of squashed because of the situation we're in. We're all got this image of what we think a relationship's gonna be and what that can be for us. And so you try to hang on to that as long as you can. And I got mad when Paul tried to use the child as an excuse for his addiction.
Oh, what moment was that?
When you were all about taking care of her, and I was alone, and
Oh, yeah.
that, you
Yeah.
remember?
Yeah. Now I get
I'm
you.
like,
yeah.
you selfish. That's what we,
Sure.
you know, because they're depending on you. She's staying home taking care of your child. And they're depending on you to bring home, you know, food, pay for electricity and whatnot. And then when she found the receipts shoved in the car, I was like, you've got to be kidding.
Yeah.
And she's going hungry. You know,
Yeah.
so I was not feeling very sympathetic to Paul in this situation.
Yeah, that's fine. Certainly, he's not not an idealized character. It was important for me to not present him as a monster, though, because obviously addiction is a disease, and it can take an amazing human being and reduce them to this one need, and they feel like if that one need isn't met, they will literally die, right? And so that becomes their compass, and the manipulations that they impose on other people are happening internally as well. So there is, I think, constant self-manipulation into thinking that this choice is okay because it's a matter of life and death, and there's as much denial on that side of everything is going to be okay as there is in this situation on Tuck's side. So yes, I think in this book there are times to be angry at Paul, there are times to be angry at Tuck, but ultimately I hope you don't think any of them are despicable people.
I thought you did such a good job, not only with what she was dealing with, but like you said, the world going kind of crazy. And there was one scene where she's in the checkout. I don't know if it's at a coffee shop or a grocery store, but this guy in back of her in line starts talking about, yeah, it's going to be bad down the line. And he's talking about the weather in like a broad sense. And he says, and I was in Tampa once when the storms were so bad that I woke up and left the barn and saw dead horses. And she, having, had her vet training, said, I've seen dead horses too. And he like totally ignores her. And up until that point she was saying, I liked his voice, I liked his long hair. But when she said that and he just totally like went right over her, telling about I've seen dead horses too, and started whistling, she said, okay, I don't like you anymore. And it was like this wonderful little like microcosm of people checking each other out. Well, what camp do you belong to? And I think in his case, he just might have been out of it. And she decided to disengage, but the woman in back of him started getting angry at his whistling, and I thought it was such a good little condensed scene of where we are right now.
Yeah, thanks. I think, Tuck either tries to experience or does experience these sort of odd moments of intimacy with unlikely people. And to me, I don't know, it was sort of fun to show her being at a point where she's ready to seek out intimacy with this random guy going on about God knows what, but then to be sort of rebuffed in that way, and to have, even when you try, sometimes it's not there. So
She had good boundaries because it was like, yep, I don't care about what you say anymore. Because you're just proven. Yeah. And then there was one, what was it when she was looking for answers and she went on Google. Oh gosh, I'm gonna like how can somebody be so blind? And then but the way she phrased the question into Google, it came back with Tucker Carlson's Wikipedia page, and I thought, oh, isn't that a perfect example of the world kind of going off the rails?
Yeah, there had to be a few details to sort of situate the story politically. I didn't want that to be the main thrust, but you can't, as a writer, everyone was figuring out how do I write during this era, you know, and it felt to me like there was some responsibility to at least acknowledge it.
Yeah. I mean, it was like this beautiful encapsulation.
This is why I like talking about the book with people who have read it, because as I mentioned earlier, my memory is very poor and I haven't read past the middle of the book in a very long time, and so there's a lot of parts that I remember them when you start talking about them, but not remember them on my own. Yeah.
One way that I qualify a book as to whether I like it or not is how it draws me in. And I just got sucked into your book. I mean, just swallowed up. The characters were so vivid. You could just picture every one of them and the situations. And I think the way you ended the book with her ass father, it just made me so angry. So all the feelings that arose in me as I was reading this book, it just was so real. I loved it.
Thank you. Did you get that?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you, in the beginning there was so many good things related to smells, and that brought me right there too. Was that like symbolism for addiction, or was it literally that she was trying to be a detective and that there was some smell that followed her from Pittsburgh to this island in Maine? Because that was so real to me. You know, lifting, what did it say, the curtain beside the kitchen door. And so many old Maine houses have that, like a big, heavy, ruggy thing that you pull over in the wintertime to keep the drafts out. And she's like sniffing that, she's sniffing the faucets. And at the same time, looking everywhere in the house. But was that literal, or was that just sort of like the tiger, the symbolism of the thing she had to confront and deal with?
Yeah, I don't think symbolic. I think just real. I think to me, you know, the actual island house that I grew up with, the smell has always been such a huge part of it. So that just felt very natural to write about smells and focus on smells. But then we haven't really talked much about this particular substance, this kratom, that is sort of at the center of this Paul's addiction, but it does have quite a smell to it. So I did have a period of just trying to locate this smell. So I did have fun playing with it as sort of in contrast with the smells that were so familiar, and then there was this foreign one that she couldn't place, and it was just driving her crazy.
Yeah, went in with the mildew and everything else. Yeah, that was very vivid to me. I almost felt like I was starting to identify a different smell.
Yeah. Well, this has been lovely, and I feel like we're probably over time, which is fine with me, but people might be getting hungry, tired, I don't know. So yeah, unless there are any last burning questions, I'm so pleased with the conversation that we've had. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming, Megan.
Yeah, thank you so much.